Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 8. The Power of Silence. Prologue. My books are a true account of a teaching method that Don Juan Matus, a Mexican Indian sorcerer, used in order to help me understand the sorcerer's world. In this sense, my books are the account of an ongoing process which becomes more clear to me as time goes by. It takes years of training to teach us to deal intelligently with the world of everyday life. Our schooling, whether in plain reasoning or formal topics, is rigorous because the knowledge we are trying to impart is very complex. The same criteria apply to the sorcerer's world. Their schooling, which relies on oral instruction and the manipulation of awareness, although different from ours, is just as rigorous because their knowledge is as, or perhaps more, complex introduction. At various times Don Juan attempted to name his knowledge for my benefit. He felt that the most appropriate name was Nagualism, but that the term was too obscure. Calling it simply knowledge made it too vague, and to call it witchcraft was debasing. The mastery of intent was too abstract, and the search for total freedom too long and metaphorical. Finally, because he was unable to find a more appropriate name, he called it sorcery, although he admitted it was not really accurate. Over the years, he had given me different definitions of sorcery, but he had always maintained that definitions change as knowledge increases. Toward the end of my apprenticeship, I felt I was in a position to appreciate a clearer definition, so I asked him once more. From where the average man stands, Don Juan said, sorcery is nonsense or an ominous mystery beyond his reach. And he is right, not because this is an absolute fact, but because the average man lacks the energy to deal with sorcery. He stopped for a moment before he continued. Human beings are born with a finite amount of energy, Don Juan said, an energy that is systematically deployed, beginning at the moment of birth, in order that it may be used most advantageously by the modality of the time. What do you mean by the modality of the time? I asked. The modality of the time is the precise bundle of energy fields being perceived, he answered. I believe man's perception has changed through the ages. The actual time decides the mode, the time decides which precise bundle of energy fields, out of an incalculable number, are to be used. And handling the modality of the time, those few, selected energy fields, takes all our available energy, leaving us nothing that would help us use any of the other energy fields. He urged me with a subtle movement of his eyebrows to consider all this. This is what I mean when I say that the average man lacks the energy needed to deal with sorcery, he went on. If he uses only the energy he has, he can't perceive the world sorcerers do. To perceive them, sorcerers need to use a cluster of energy fields not ordinarily used. Naturally, if the average man is to perceive those worlds and understand sorcerers' perception, he must use the same cluster they have used. And this is just not possible, because all his energy is already deployed. He paused as if searching for the appropriate words to make his point. Think of it this way, he proceeded. It isn't that as time goes by you're learning sorcery, rather, what you're learning is to save energy. And this energy will enable you to handle some of the energy fields which are inaccessible to you now. And that is sorcery. The ability to use energy fields that are not employed in perceiving the ordinary world we know. Sorcery is a state of awareness. Sorcery is the ability to perceive something which ordinary perception cannot. Everything I've put you through, Don Juan went on, each of the things I've shown you was only a device to convince you that there's more to us than meets the eye. We don't need anyone to teach us sorcery, because there is really nothing to learn. What we need is a teacher to convince us that there is incalculable power at our fingertips. What a strange paradox. Every warrior on the path of knowledge thinks, at one time or another, that he's learning sorcery, but all he's doing is allowing himself to be convinced of the power hidden in his being, and that he can reach it. Is that what you're doing, Don Juan, convincing me? Exactly. I'm trying to convince you that you can reach that power. I went through the same thing. And I was as hard to convince as you are. Once we have reached it, what exactly do we do with it, Don Juan? Nothing. Once we have reached it, it will, by itself, make use of energy fields which are available to us but inaccessible. And that, as I have said, is sorcery. We begin then to see that is, to perceive something else, not as imagination, but as real and concrete. And then we begin to know without having to use words. And what any of us does with that increased perception, with that silent knowledge, depends on our own temperament. On another occasion, he gave me another kind of explanation. We were discussing an unrelated topic when he abruptly changed the subject and began to tell me a joke. He laughed and, very gently, patted my back between the shoulder blades, as if he were shy, and it was too forward of him to touch me. He chuckled at my nervous reaction. "You're skittish," he said teasingly, and slapped my back with greater force. My ears buzzed. For an instant I lost my breath. It felt as though he had hurt my lungs. Every breath brought me great discomfort. Yet, after I had coughed and choked a few times, my nasal passages opened, and I found myself taking deep, soothing breaths. I had such a feeling of well-being that I was not even annoyed at him for his blow, which had been hard as well as unexpected. Then Don Juan began a most remarkable explanation. Clearly and concisely, he gave me a different and more precise definition of sorcery. I had entered into a wondrous state of awareness. I had such clarity of mind that I was able to comprehend and assimilate everything Don Juan was saying. He said that in the universe there is an unmeasurable, indescribable force which sorcerers call intent, and that absolutely everything that exists in the entire cosmos is attached to intent by a connecting link. Sorcerers, or warriors, as he called them, were concerned with discussing, understanding, and employing that connecting link. They were especially concerned with cleaning it of the numbing effects brought about by the ordinary concerns of their everyday lives. Sorcery at this level could be defined as the procedure of cleaning one's connecting link to intent. Don Juan stressed that this cleaning procedure was extremely difficult to understand, or to learn to perform. Sorcerers, therefore, divided their instruction into two categories. One was instruction for the everyday life state of awareness, in which the cleaning process was presented in a disguised fashion. The other was instruction for the states of heightened awareness, such as the one I was presently experiencing, in which sorcerers obtained knowledge directly from intent, without the distracting intervention of spoken language. Don Juan explained that by using heightened awareness over thousands of years of painful struggle, sorcerers had gained specific insights into intent, and that they had passed these nuggets of direct knowledge on from generation to the present. He said that the task of sorcery is to take this seemingly incomprehensible knowledge and make it understandable by the standards of awareness of everyday life. Then he explained the role of the guide in the lives of sorcerers. He said that a guide is called the Nagual, and that the Nagual is a man or a woman with extraordinary energy, a teacher who has sobriety, endurance, stability. Someone seers see as a luminous sphere having 4 compartments, as if 4 luminous balls have been compressed together. Because of their extraordinary energy, Naguals are intermediaries. Their energy allows them to channel peace, harmony, laughter, and knowledge directly from the source, from intent, and transmit them to their companions. Naguals are responsible for supplying what sorcerers call the minimal chance, the awareness of one's connection with intent. I told him that my mind was grasping everything he was telling me, that the only part of his explanation still unclear to me was why 2 sets of teachings were needed. I could understand everything he was saying about his world easily, and yet he had described the process of understanding as very difficult. You will need a lifetime to remember the insights you've had today, he said, because most of them were silent knowledge. A few moments from now you will have forgotten them. That's one of the unfathomable mysteries of awareness. Don Juan then made me shift levels of consciousness by striking me on my left side, at the edge of my ribcage. Instantly I lost my extraordinary clarity of mind and could not remember having ever had it. Don Juan himself set me the task of writing about the premises of sorcery. Once, very casually in the early stages of my apprenticeship, he suggested that I write a book in order to make use of the notes I had always taken. I had accumulated reams of notes and never considered what to do with them. I argued that the suggestion was absurd because I was not a writer. Of course, you're not a writer, he said, so you will have to use sorcery. First, you must visualize your experiences as if you were reliving them, and then you must see the text in your dreaming. For you, writing should not be a literary exercise, but rather an exercise in sorcery. I have written in that manner about the premises of sorcery, just as Don Juan explained them to me, within the context of his teaching. In his teaching scheme, which was developed by sorcerers of ancient times, there were 2 categories of instruction. One was called teachings for the right side, carried out in the ordinary state of awareness. The other was called teachings for the left side, put into practice solely in states of heightened awareness. These 2 categories allowed teachers to school their apprentices toward 3 areas of expertise: the mastery of awareness, the art of stalking, and the mastery of intent. These 3 areas of expertise are the 3 riddles sorcerers encounter in their search for knowledge. The mastery of awareness is the riddle of the mind, the perplexity sorcerers experience when they recognize the astounding mystery and scope of awareness and perception. The art of stalking is the riddle of the heart, the puzzlement sorcerers feel upon becoming aware of 2 things. First, that the world appears to us to be unalterably objective and factual, because of peculiarities of our awareness and perception. Second, that if different peculiarities of perception come into play, the very things about the world that seem so unalterably objective and factual change. The mastery of intent is the riddle of the spirit, or the paradox of the abstract sorcerer's thoughts and actions projected beyond our human condition. Don Juan's instruction on the art of stalking and the mastery of intent depended upon his instruction on the mastery of awareness, which was the cornerstone of his teachings, and which consist of the following basic premises. 1. The universe is an infinite agglomeration of energy fields, resembling threads of light. 2. These energy fields, called the eagle's emanations, radiate from a source of inconceivable proportions metaphorically called the eagle. 3. Human beings are also composed of an incalculable number of the same thread-like energy fields. These eagle's emanations form an encased agglomeration that manifests itself as a ball of light the size of the person's body, with the arms extended laterally, like a giant luminous egg. 4. Only a very small group of the energy fields inside this luminous ball are lit up by a point of intense brilliance located on the ball's surface. 5. Perception occurs when the energy fields in that small group immediately surrounding the point of brilliance extend their light to illuminate identical energy fields outside the ball. Since the only energy fields perceivable are those lit by the point of brilliance, that point is named the point where perception is assembled or simply the assemblage point. 6. The assemblage point can be moved from its usual position on the surface of the luminous ball to another position on the surface or into the interior. Since the brilliance of the assemblage point can light up whatever energy field it comes in contact with, when it moves to a new position, it immediately brightens up new energy fields, making them perceivable. This perception is known as seeing. 7. When the assemblage point shifts, it makes possible the perception of an entirely different world as objective and factual as the one we normally perceive. Sorcerers go into that other world to get energy, power, solutions to general and particular problems, or to face the unimaginable. 8. Intent is the pervasive force that causes us to perceive. We do not become aware because we perceive, rather, we perceive as a result of the pressure and intrusion of intent. 9. The aim of sorcerers is to reach a state of total awareness in order to experience all the possibilities of perception available to man. This state of awareness even implies an alternative way of dying. A level of practical knowledge was included as part of teaching the mastery of awareness. On that practical level, Don Juan taught the procedures necessary to move the assemblage point. The two great systems devised by the sorcerer-seers of ancient times to accomplish this were dreaming, the control and utilization of dreams, and stalking, the control of behavior. Moving one's assemblage point was an essential maneuver that every sorcerer had to learn. Some of them, the Naguals, also learned to perform it for others. They were able to dislodge the assemblage point from its customary position by delivering a hard slap directly to the assemblage point. This blow, which was experienced as a smack on the right shoulder blade although the body was never touched, resulted in a state of heightened awareness. In compliance with his tradition, it was exclusively in these states of heightened awareness that Don Juan carried out the most important and dramatic part of his teachings: the instructions for the left side. Because of the extraordinary quality of these states, Don Juan demanded that I not discuss them with others until we had concluded everything in the sorcerer's teaching scheme. That demand was not difficult for me to accept. In those unique states of awareness, my capabilities for understanding the instruction were unbelievably enhanced, but at the same time my capabilities for describing or even remembering it were impaired. I could function in those states with proficiency and assuredness, but I could not recollect anything about them once I returned to my normal consciousness. It took me years to be able to make the crucial conversion of my enhanced awareness into plain memory. My reason and common sense delayed this moment because they were colliding head-on with the preposterous, unthinkable reality of heightened awareness and direct knowledge. For years, the resulting cognitive disarrangement forced me to avoid the issue by not thinking about it. Whatever I have written about my sorcery apprenticeship, up to now, has been a recounting of how Don Juan taught me the mastery of awareness. I have not yet described the art of stalking or the mastery of intent. Don Juan taught me their principles and applications with the help of two of his companions, a sorcerer named Vicente Medrano and another named Silvio Manuel, but whatever I learned from them still remains clouded in what Don Juan called the intricacies of heightened awareness. Until now, it has been impossible for me to write or even to think coherently about the art of stalking and the mastery of intent. My mistake has been to regard them as subjects for normal memory and recollection. They are, but at the same time they are not. In order to resolve this contradiction, I have not pursued the subjects directly of virtual impossibility, but have dealt with them indirectly through the concluding topic of Don Juan's instruction: the stories of the sorcerers of the past. He recounted these stories to make evident what he called the abstract cores of his lessons. But I was incapable of grasping the nature of the abstract cores, despite his comprehensive explanations, which, I know now, were intended more to open my mind than to explain anything in a rational manner. His way of talking made me believe for many years that his explanations of the abstract cores were like academic dissertations, and all I was able to do, under these circumstances, was to take his explanations as given. They became part of my tacit acceptance of his teachings, but without the thorough assessment on my part that was essential to understanding them. Don Juan presented 3 sets of 6 abstract cores each, arranged in an increasing level of complexity. I have dealt here with the first set, which is composed of the following: the manifestations of the spirit, the knock of the spirit, the trickery of the spirit, the descent of the spirit, the requirements of intent, and handling intent. The manifestations of the spirit. The first abstract core. Don Juan, whenever it was pertinent, used to tell me brief stories about the sorcerers of his lineage, especially his teacher, the Nagual Julian. They were not really stories, but rather descriptions of the way those sorcerers behaved and of aspects of their personalities. These accounts were each designed to shed light on a specific topic in my apprenticeship. I had heard the same stories from the other 15 members of Don Juan's group of sorcerers, but none of these accounts had been able to give me a clear picture of the people they described. Since I had no way of persuading Don Juan to give me more details about those sorcerers, I had resigned myself to the idea of never knowing about them in any depth. One afternoon, in the mountains of southern Mexico, Don Juan, after having explained to me more about the intricacies of the mastery of awareness, made a statement that completely baffled me. "I think it's time for us to talk about the sorcerers of our past," he said. Don Juan explained that it was necessary that I begin drawing conclusions based on a systematic view of the past, conclusions about both the world of daily affairs and the sorcerer's world. Sorcerers are vitally concerned with their past, he said. But I don't mean their personal past. For sorcerers, their past is what other sorcerers in bygone days have done. And what we are now going to do is examine that past. The average man also examines the past. But it's mostly his personal past he examines, and he does so for personal reasons. Sorcerers do quite the opposite. They consult their past in order to obtain a point of reference. But isn't that what everyone does? Look at the past to get a point of reference? No, he answered emphatically. The average man measures himself against the past, whether his personal past or the past knowledge of his time, in order to find justifications for his present or future behavior, or to establish a model for himself. Only sorcerers genuinely seek a point of reference in their past. Perhaps, Don Juan, things would be clear to me if you tell me what a point of reference for a sorcerer is. For sorcerers, establishing a point of reference means getting a chance to examine intent, he replied. Which is exactly the aim of this final topic of instruction. And nothing can give sorcerers a better view of intent than examining stories of other sorcerers battling to understand the same force. He explained that as they examined their past, the sorcerers of his lineage took careful notice of the basic abstract order of their knowledge. In sorcery there are 21 abstract cores, Don Juan went on. And then, based on those abstract cores, there are scores of sorcery stories about the Nagwals of our lineage, battling to understand the spirit. It's time to tell you the abstract cores and the sorcery stories. I waited for Don Juan to begin telling me the stories, but he changed the subject and went back to explaining awareness. Wait a minute, I protested. What about the sorcery stories? Aren't you going to tell them to me? Of course I am, he said. But they are not stories that one can tell as if they were tales. You've got to think your way through them and then rethink them, relive them, so to speak. There was a long silence. I became very cautious and was afraid that if I persisted in asking him again to tell me the stories, I could be committing myself to something I might later regret. But my curiosity was greater than my good sense. Well, let's get on with them, I croaked. Don Juan, obviously catching the gist of my thoughts, smiled maliciously. He stood and signaled me to follow. We had been sitting on some dry rocks at the bottom of a gully. It was mid-afternoon. The sky was dark and cloudy. Low, almost black rain clouds hovered above the peaks to the east. In comparison, the high clouds made the sky seem clear to the south. Earlier it had rained heavily, but then the rain seemed to have retreated to a hiding place, leaving behind only a threat. I should have been chilled to the bone, for it was very cold. But I was warm. As I clutched a rock Don Juan had given me to hold, I realized that this sensation of being warm in nearly freezing weather was familiar to me, yet it amazed me each time. Whenever I seemed about to freeze, Don Juan would give me a branch to hold, or a stone, or he would put a bunch of leaves under my shirt, on the tip of my sternum, and that would be sufficient to raise my body temperature. I had tried unsuccessfully to recreate, by myself, the effect of his ministrations. He told me it was not the ministrations, but his inner silence that kept me warm, and the branches or stones or leaves were merely devices to trap my attention and maintain it in focus. Moving quickly, we climbed the steep west side of a mountain until we reached a rock ledge at the very top. We were in the foothills of a higher range of mountains. From the rock ledge I could see that fog had begun to move onto the south end of the valley floor below us. Low, wispy clouds seemed to be closing in on us, too, sliding down from the black-green, high mountain peaks to the west. After the rain, under the dark cloudy sky, the valley and the mountains to the east and south appeared covered in a mantle of black-green silence. "This is the ideal place to have a talk," Don Juan said, sitting on the rock floor of a concealed shallow cave. The cave was perfect for the two of us to sit side by side. Our heads were nearly touching the roof, and our backs fitted snugly against the curved surface of the rock wall. It was as if the cave had been carved deliberately to accommodate two persons of our size. I noticed another strange feature of the cave. When I stood on the ledge, I could see the entire valley and the mountain ranges to the east and south, but when I sat down, I was boxed in by the rocks. Yet the ledge was at the level of the cave floor, and flat. I was about to point this strange effect out to Don Juan, but he anticipated me. "This cave is man-made," he said. "The ledge is slanted, but the eye doesn't register the incline." "Who made this cave, Don Juan?" "The ancient sorcerers. Perhaps thousands of years ago. And one of the peculiarities of this cave is that animals and insects and even people stay away from it. The ancient sorcerers seem to have infused it with an ominous charge that makes every living thing feel ill at ease. But strangely, I felt irrationally secure and happy there. A sensation of physical contentment made my entire body tingle. I actually felt the most agreeable, the most delectable sensation in my stomach. It was as if my nerves were being tickled. "I don't feel ill at ease," I commented. "Neither do I," he said. "Which only means that you and I aren't that far temperamentally from those old sorcerers of the past, something which worries me no end." I was afraid to pursue that subject any further, so I waited for him to talk. "The first sorcery story I am going to tell you is called The Manifestations of the Spirit," Don Juan began, "but don't let the title mystify you. The Manifestations of the Spirit is only the first abstract core around which the first sorcery story is built. That first abstract core is a story in itself," he went on. "The story says that once upon a time there was a man, an average man without any special attributes. He was, like everyone else, a conduit for the Spirit. And by virtue of that, like everyone else, he was part of the Spirit, part of the abstract. But he didn't know it. The world kept him so busy that he had neither the time nor the inclination really to examine the matter. The Spirit tried, uselessly, to reveal their connection. Using an inner voice, the Spirit disclosed its secrets, but the man was incapable of understanding the revelations. Naturally, he heard the inner voice, but he believed it to be his own feelings he was feeling and his own thoughts he was thinking. The Spirit, in order to shake him out of his slumber, gave him 3 signs, 3 successive manifestations. The Spirit physically crossed the man's path in the most obvious manner. But the man was oblivious to anything but his self-concern." Don Juan stopped and looked at me as he did whenever he was waiting for my comments and questions. I had nothing to say. I did not understand the point he was trying to make. "I've just told you the first abstract core," he continued. "The only other thing I could add is that because of the man's absolute unwillingness to understand, the Spirit was forced to use trickery. And trickery became the essence of the sorcerer's path. But that is another story." Don Juan explained that sorcerers understood this abstract core to be a blueprint for events, or a recurrent pattern that appeared every time intent was giving an indication of something meaningful. Abstract cores, then, were blueprints of complete chains of events. He assured me that by means beyond comprehension, every detail of every abstract core reoccurred to every apprentice Nagwal. He further assured me that he had helped intent to involve me in all the abstract cores of sorcery, in the same manner that his benefactor, the Nagual Julian, and all the Naguals before him, had involved their apprentices. The process by which each apprentice Nagual encountered the abstract cores created a series of accounts woven around those abstract cores, incorporating the particular details of each apprentice's personality and circumstances. He said, for example, that I had my own story about the manifestations of the spirit, he had his benefactor had his own, so had the Nagual that preceded him, and so on, and so forth. What is my story about the manifestations of the spirit? I asked, somewhat mystified. If any warrior is aware of his stories, it's you, he replied. After all, you've been writing about them for years. But you didn't notice the abstract cores because you are a practical man. You do everything only for the purpose of enhancing your practicality. Although you handled your stories to exhaustion, you had no idea that there was an abstract core in them. Everything I've done appears to you, therefore, as an often whimsical practical activity. Teaching sorcery to a reluctant and, most of the time, stupid apprentice. As long as you see it in those terms, the abstract cores will elude you. You must forgive me, Don Juan, I said, but your statements are very confusing. What are you saying? I'm trying to introduce the sorcery stories as a subject, he replied. I've never talked to you specifically about this topic because traditionally it's left hidden. It is the spirit's last artifice. It is said that when the apprentice understands the abstract cores, it's like the placing of the stone that caps and seals a pyramid. It was getting dark, and it looked as though it was about to rain again. I worried that if the wind blew from east to west while it was raining, we were going to get soaked in that cave. I was sure Don Juan was aware of that, but he seemed to ignore it. It won't rain again until tomorrow morning, he said. Hearing my inner thoughts being answered made me jump involuntarily and hit the top of my head on the cave roof. It was a thud that sounded worse than it felt. Don Juan held his sides laughing. After a while my head really began to hurt and I had to massage it. Your company is as enjoyable to me as mine must have been to my benefactor, he said, and began to laugh again. We were quiet for a few minutes. The silence around me was ominous. I fancied that I could hear the rustling of the low clouds as they descended on us from the higher mountains. Then I realized that what I was hearing was the soft wind. From my position in the shallow cave, it sounded like the whispering of human voices. I had the incredible good luck to be taught by two Naguals, Don Juan said, and broke the mesmeric grip the wind had on me at that moment. One was, of course, my benefactor, the Nagual Julian, and the other was his benefactor, the Nagual Elias. My case was unique. Why was your case unique? I asked. Because for generations Naguals have gathered their apprentices years after their own teachers have left the world, he explained. Except my benefactor. I became the Nagual Julian's apprentice 8 years before his benefactor left the world. I had 8 years as grace. It was the luckiest thing that could have happened to me, for I had the opportunity to be taught by two opposite temperaments. It was like being reared by a powerful father and an even more powerful grandfather who don't see eye to eye. In such a contest, the grandfather always wins. So I'm properly the product of the Nagual Elias's teachings. I was closer to him not only in temperament but also in looks. I'd say that I owe him my fine-tuning. However, the bulk of the work that went into turning me from a miserable being into an impeccable warrior I owe to my benefactor, the Nagual Julian. What was the Nagual Julian like physically? I asked. Do you know that to this day it's hard for me to visualize him? Don Juan said. I know that sounds absurd, but depending on his needs or the circumstances, he could be either young or old, handsome or homely, effete and weak or strong and virile, fat or slender, of medium height or extremely short. Do you mean he was an actor acting out different roles with the aid of props? No, there were no props involved and he was not merely an actor. He was, of course, a great actor in his own right, but that is different. The point is that he was capable of transforming himself and becoming all those diametrically opposed persons. Being a great actor enabled him to portray all the minute peculiarities of behavior that made each specific being real. Let us say that he was at ease in every change of being, as you are at ease in every change of clothes. Eagerly, I asked Don Juan to tell me more about his benefactor's transformations. He said that someone taught him how to elicit those transformations, but that to explain any further would force him to overlap into different stories. What did the Nagual Julian look like when he wasn't transforming himself? I asked. Let's say that before he became an Nagual he was very slim and muscular, Don Juan said. His hair was black, thick, and wavy. He had a long, fine nose, strong big white teeth, an oval face, strong jaw, and shiny dark brown eyes. He was about 5 feet 8 inches tall. He was not Indian or even a brown Mexican, but he was not Anglo-white either. In fact, his complexion seemed to be like no one else's, especially in his later years when his ever-changing complexion shifted constantly from dark to very light, and back again to dark. When I first met him he was a light brown old man, then as time went by, he became a light-skinned young man, perhaps only a few years older than me. I was 20 at that time. But if the changes of his outer appearance were astonishing, Don Juan went on, the changes of mood and behavior that accompanied each transformation were even more astonishing. For example, when he was a fat young man, he was jolly and sensual. When he was a skinny old man, he was petty and vindictive. When he was a fat old man, he was the greatest imbecile there was. Was he ever himself? I asked. Not the way I am myself, he replied. Since I'm not interested in transformation I am always the same. But he was not like me at all. Don Juan looked at me as if he were assessing my inner strength. He smiled, shook his head from side to side and broke into a belly laugh. What's so funny, Don Juan? I asked. The fact is that you're still too prudish and stiff to appreciate fully the nature of my benefactor's transformations and their total scope, he said. I only hope that when I tell you about them you don't become morbidly obsessed. For some reason I suddenly became quite uncomfortable and had to change the subject. Why are the Naguals called benefactors and not simply teachers? I asked nervously. Calling a Nagual a benefactor is a gesture his apprentices make, Don Juan said. An Nagual creates an overwhelming feeling of gratitude in his disciples. After all, an Nagual molds them and guides them through unimaginable areas. I remarked that to teach was in my opinion the greatest, most altruistic act anyone could perform for another. For you, teaching is talking about patterns, he said. For a sorcerer, to teach is what a Nagual does for his apprentices. For them he taps the prevailing force in the universe. Intent, the force that changes and reorders things or keeps them as they are. The Nagwal formulates, then guides the consequences that force can have on his disciples. Without the Nagwal's molding intent, there would be no awe, no wonder for them. And his apprentices, instead of embarking on a magical journey of discovery, would only be learning a trade. Healer, sorcerer, diviner, charlatan, or whatever. Can you explain intent to me? I asked. The only way to know intent, he replied, is to know it directly through a living connection that exists between intent and all sentient beings. Sorcerers call intent the indescribable, the spirit, the abstract, the Nagwal. I would prefer to call it Nagwal, but it overlaps with the name for the leader, the benefactor, who is also called Nagwal, so I have opted for calling it the spirit, intent, the abstract. Don Juan stopped abruptly and recommended that I keep quiet and think about what he had told me. By then it was very dark. The silence was so profound that instead of lulling me into a restful state, it agitated me. I could not maintain order in my thoughts. I tried to focus my attention on the story he had told me, but instead I thought of everything else, until finally I fell asleep. The impeccability of the Nagwal Elias. I had no way of telling how long I slept in that cave. Don Juan's voice startled me and I awoke. He was saying that the first sorcery story concerning the manifestations of the spirit was an account of the relationship between intent and the Nagwal. It was the story of how the spirit set up a lure for the Nagwal, a prospective disciple, and of how the Nagwal had to evaluate the lure before making his decision either to accept or reject it. It was very dark in the cave, and the small space was confining. Ordinarily, an area of that size would have made me claustrophobic, but the cave kept soothing me, dispelling my feelings of annoyance. Also, something in the configuration of the cave absorbed the echoes of Don Juan's words. Don Juan explained that every act performed by sorcerers, especially by the Nagwals, was either performed as a way to strengthen their link with intent, or as a response triggered by the link itself. Sorcerers, and specifically the Nagwals, therefore had to be actively and permanently on the lookout for manifestations of the spirit. Such manifestations were called gestures of the spirit or, more simply, indications or omens. He repeated a story he had already told me, the story of how he had met his benefactor, the Nagwal Julian. Don Juan had been cajoled by two crooked men to take a job on an isolated hacienda. One of the men, the foreman of the hacienda, simply took possession of Don Juan and in effect made him a slave. Desperate and with no other course of action, Don Juan escaped. The violent foreman chased him and caught him on a country road where he shot Don Juan in the chest and left him for dead. Don Juan was lying unconscious in the road, bleeding to death, when the Nagwal Julian came along. Using his healer's knowledge, he stopped the bleeding, took Don Juan, who was still unconscious, home and cured him. The indications the spirit gave the Nagwal Julian about Don Juan were, first, a small cyclone that lifted a cone of dust on the road a couple of yards from where he lay. The second omen was the thought which had crossed the Nagwal Julian's mind an instant before he had heard the report of the gun a few yards away, that it was time to have an apprentice Nagwal. Moments later, the spirit gave him the third omen, when he ran to take cover and instead collided with the gunman, putting him to flight, perhaps preventing him from shooting Don Juan a second time. A collision with someone was the type of blunder which no sorcerer, much less a Nagual, should ever make. The Nagual Julian immediately evaluated the opportunity. When he saw Don Juan, he understood the reason for the spirit's manifestation. Here was a double man, a perfect candidate to be his apprentice Nagual. This brought up a nagging rational concern for me. I wanted to know if sorcerers could interpret an omen erroneously. Don Juan replied that although my question sounded perfectly legitimate, it was inapplicable, like the majority of my questions, because I asked them based on my experiences in the world of everyday life. Thus they were always about tested procedures, steps to be followed, and rules of meticulousness, but had nothing to do with the premises of sorcery. He pointed out that the flaw in my reasoning was that I always failed to include my experiences in the sorcerer's world. I argued that very few of my experiences in the sorcerer's world had continuity, and therefore I could not make use of those experiences in my present day-to-day life. Very few times, and only when I was in states of profound heightened awareness, had I remembered everything. At the level of heightened awareness I usually reached, the only experience that had continuity between past and present was that of knowing him. He responded cuttingly that I was perfectly capable of engaging in sorcerer's reasonings, because I had experienced the sorcery premises in my normal state of awareness. In a more mellow tone he added that heightened awareness did not reveal everything until the whole edifice of sorcery knowledge was completed. Then he answered my question about whether or not sorcerers could misinterpret omens. He explained that when a sorcerer interpreted an omen he knew its exact meaning without having any notion of how he knew it. This was one of the bewildering effects of the connecting link with intent. Sorcerers had a sense of knowing things directly. How sure they were depended on the strength and clarity of their connecting link. He said that the feeling everyone knows as intuition is the activation of our link with intent. And since sorcerers deliberately pursue the understanding and strengthening of that link, it could be said that they intuit everything unerringly and accurately. Reading omens is commonplace for sorcerers. Mistakes happen only when personal feelings intervene and cloud the sorcerer's connecting link with intent. Otherwise, their direct knowledge is totally accurate and functional. We remained quiet for a while. All of a sudden he said, "I am going to tell you a story about the Nagual Elias and the manifestation of the spirit." The spirit manifests itself to a sorcerer, especially to a Nagual, at every turn. However, this is not the entire truth. The entire truth is that the spirit reveals itself to everyone with the same intensity and consistency, but only sorcerers, and Naguals in particular, are attuned to such revelations. Don Juan began his story. He said that the Nagual Elias had been riding his horse to the city one day, taking him through a shortcut by some cornfields when suddenly his horse shied, frightened by the low, fast sweep of a falcon that missed the Nagual's straw hat by only a few inches. The Nagual immediately dismounted and began to look around. He saw a strange young man among the tall, dry cornstalks. The man was dressed in an expensive dark suit and appeared alien there. The Nagual Elias was used to the sight of peasants or landowners in the fields, but he had never seen an elegantly dressed city man moving through the fields, with apparent disregard for his expensive shoes and clothes. The Nagual tethered his horse and walked toward the young man. He recognized the flight of the falcon, as well as the man's apparel, as obvious manifestations of the spirit which he could not disregard. He got very close to the young man and saw what was going on. The man was chasing a peasant woman who was running a few yards ahead of him, dodging and laughing with him. The contradiction was quite apparent to the Nagual. The two people cavorting in the cornfield did not belong together. The Nagual thought that the man must be the landowner's son and the woman a servant in the house. He felt embarrassed to be observing them and was about to turn and leave when the falcon again swept over the cornfield and this time brushed the young man's head. The falcon alarmed the couple and they stopped and looked up, trying to anticipate another sweep. The Nagual noticed that the man was thin and handsome and had haunting, restless eyes. Then the couple became bored watching for the falcon and returned to their play. The man caught the woman, embraced her and gently laid her on the ground. But instead of trying to make love to her, as the Nagual assumed he would do next, he removed his own clothes and paraded naked in front of the woman. She did not shyly close her eyes or scream with embarrassment or fright. She giggled, mesmerized by the prancing naked man, who moved around her like a satyr, making lewd gestures and laughing. Finally, apparently overpowered by the sight, she uttered a wild cry, rose, and threw herself into the young man's arms. Don Juan said that Nagual Elias confessed to him that the indications of the spirit on that occasion had been most baffling. It was clearly evident that the man was insane. Otherwise, knowing how protective peasants were of their women, he would not have considered seducing a young peasant woman in broad daylight a few yards from the road, and naked to boot. Don Juan broke into a laugh and told me that in those days to take off one's clothes and engage in a sexual act in broad daylight in such a place meant one had to be either insane or blessed by the spirit. He added that what the man had done might not seem remarkable nowadays. But then, nearly 100 years ago, people were infinitely more inhibited. All of this convinced the Nagual Elias from the moment he laid eyes on the man that he was both insane and blessed by the spirit. He worried that peasants might happen by, become enraged and lynch the man on the spot. But no one did. It felt to the Nagual as if time had been suspended. When the man finished making love, he put on his clothes, took out a handkerchief, meticulously dusted his shoes and, all the while making wild promises to the girl, went on his way. The Nagual Elias followed him. In fact, he followed him for several days and found out that his name was Julian and that he was an actor. Subsequently, the Nagual saw him on the stage often enough to realize that the actor had a great deal of charisma. The audience, especially the women, loved him. And he had no scruples about making use of his charismatic gifts to seduce female admirers. As the Nagual followed the actor, he was able to witness his seduction technique more than once. It entailed showing himself naked to his adoring fans as soon as he got them alone, then waiting until the women, stunned by his display, surrendered. The technique seemed extremely effective for him. The Nagual had to admit that the actor was a great success, except on one count. He was mortally ill. The Nagual had seen the black shadow of death that followed him everywhere. Don Juan explained again something he had told me years before, that our death was a black spot right behind the left shoulder. He said that sorcerers knew when a person was close to dying because they could see the dark spot, which became a moving shadow the exact size and shape of the person to whom it belonged. As he recognized the imminent presence of death, the Nagual was plunged into a numbing perplexity. He wondered why the spirit was singling out such a sick person. He had been taught that in a natural state replacement, not repair, prevailed. And the Nagwal doubted that he had the ability or the strength to heal this young man or resist the black shadow of his death. He even doubted if he would be able to discover why the spirit had involved him in a display of such obvious waste. The Nagwal could do nothing but stay with the actor, follow him around, and wait for the opportunity to see in greater depth. Don Juan explained that a Nagwal's first reaction, upon being faced with the manifestations of the spirit, is to see the persons involved. The Nagwal Elias had been meticulous about seeing the man the moment he laid eyes on him. He had also seen the peasant woman who was part of the spirit's manifestation, but he had seen nothing that, in his judgment, could have warranted the spirit's display. In the course of witnessing another seduction, however, the Nagwal's ability to see took on a new depth. This time the actor's adoring fan was the daughter of a rich landowner. And from the start she was in complete control. The Nagwal found out about their rendezvous because he overheard her daring the actor to meet her the next day. The Nagwal was hiding across the street at dawn when the young woman left her house, and instead of going to early mass, she went to join the actor. The actor was waiting for her, and she coaxed him into following her to the open fields. He appeared to hesitate, but she taunted him and would not allow him to withdraw. As the Nagwal watched them sneaking away, he had an absolute conviction that something was going to happen on that day, which neither of the players was anticipating. He saw that the actor's black shadow had grown to almost twice his height. The Nagwal deduced from the mysterious hard look in the young woman's eyes that she too had felt the black shadow of death at an intuitive level. The actor seemed preoccupied. He did not laugh as he had on other occasions. They walked quite a distance. At one point, they spotted the Nagwal following them, but he instantly pretended to be working the land, a peasant who belonged there. That made the couple relax and allowed the Nagwal to come closer. Then the moment came when the actor tossed off his clothes and showed himself to the girl. But instead of swooning and falling into his arms as his other conquests had, this girl began to hit him. She kicked and punched him mercilessly and stepped on his bare toes, making him cry out with pain. The Nagwal knew the man had not threatened or harmed the young woman. He had not laid a finger on her. She was the only one fighting. He was merely trying to parry the blows, and persistently, but without enthusiasm, trying to entice her by showing her his genitals. The Nagwal was filled with both revulsion and admiration. He could perceive that the actor was an irredeemable libertine, but he could also perceive equally easily that there was something unique, although revolting, about him. It baffled the Nagwal to see that the man's connecting link with the spirit was extraordinarily clear. Finally the attack ended. The woman stopped beating the actor. But then, instead of running away, she surrendered, lay down and told the actor he could now have his way with her. The Nagwal observed that the man was so exhausted he was practically unconscious. Yet despite his fatigue he went right ahead and consummated his seduction. The Nagwal was laughing and pondering that useless man's great stamina and determination when the woman screamed and the actor began to gasp. The Nagwal saw how the black shadow struck the actor. It went like a dagger, with pinpoint accuracy into his gap. Don Juan made a digression at this point to elaborate on something he had explained before. He had described the gap, an opening in our luminous shell at the height of the navel, where the force of death ceaselessly struck. What Don Juan now explained was that when death hit healthy beings, it was with a ball-like blow like the punch of a fist. But when beings were dying, death struck them with a dagger-like thrust. Thus the Nagual Elias knew without any question that the actor was as good as dead, and his death automatically finished his own interest in the spirit's designs. There were no designs left. Death had leveled everything. He rose from his hiding place and started to leave when something made him hesitate. It was the young woman's calmness. She was nonchalantly putting on the few pieces of clothing she had taken off and was whistling tunelessly as if nothing had happened. And then the Nagual saw that in relaxing to accept the presence of death, the man's body had released a protecting veil and revealed his true nature. He was a double man of tremendous resources, capable of creating a screen for protection or disguise, a natural sorcerer, and a perfect candidate for a Nagual apprentice, had it not been for the black shadow of death. The Nagual was completely taken aback by that sight. He now understood the designs of the spirit, but failed to comprehend how such a useless man could fit in the sorcerer's scheme of things. The woman in the meantime had stood up and without so much as a glance at the man, whose body was contorting with death spasms, walked away. The Nagual then saw her luminosity and realized that her extreme aggressiveness was the result of an enormous flow of superfluous energy. He became convinced that if she did not put that energy to sober use, it would get the best of her, and there was no telling what misfortunes it would cause her. As the Nagual watched the unconcern with which she walked away, he realized that the spirit had given him another manifestation. He needed to be calm, nonchalant. He needed to act as if he had nothing to lose and intervene for the hell of it. In true Nagual fashion, he decided to tackle the impossible, with no one except the spirit as witness. Don Juan commented that it took incidents like this to test whether a Nagual is the real thing or a fake. Naguals make decisions. With no regard for the consequences, they take action or choose not to. Imposters ponder and become paralyzed. The Nagual Elias, having made his decision, walked calmly to the side of the dying man and did the first thing his body, not his mind, compelled him to do. He struck the man's assemblage point to cause him to enter into heightened awareness. He struck him frantically again and again until his assemblage point moved. Aided by the force of death itself, the Nagual's blows sent the man's assemblage point to a place where death no longer mattered, and there he stopped dying. By the time the actor was breathing again, the Nagual had become aware of the magnitude of his responsibility. If the man was to fend off the force of his death, it would be necessary for him to remain in deep heightened awareness until death had been repelled. The man's advanced physical deterioration meant he could not be moved from the spot, or he would instantly die. The Nagual did the only thing possible under the circumstances. He built a shack around the body. There, for 3 months he nursed the totally immobilized man. My rational thoughts took over, and instead of just listening, I wanted to know how the Nagual Elias could build a shack on someone else's land. I was aware of the rural people's passion about land ownership and its accompanying feelings of territoriality. Don Juan admitted that he had asked the same question himself. And the Nagual Elias had said that the spirit itself had made it possible. This was the case with everything a Nagual undertook, providing he followed the spirit's manifestations. The first thing the Nagual Elias did, when the actor was breathing again, was to run after the young woman. She was an important part of the spirit's manifestation. He caught up with her not too far from the spot where the actor lay barely alive. Rather than talking to her about the man's plight and trying to convince her to help him, he again assumed total responsibility for his actions and jumped on her like a lion, striking her assemblage point a mighty blow. Both she and the actor were capable of sustaining life or death blows. Her assemblage point moved, but began to shift erratically once it was loose. The Nagwal carried the young woman to where the actor lay. Then he spent the entire day trying to keep her from losing her mind and the man from losing his life. When he was fairly certain he had a degree of control, he went to the woman's father and told him that lightning must have struck his daughter and made her temporarily mad. He took the father to where she lay and said that the young man, whoever he was, had taken the whole charge of the lightning with his body, thus saving the girl from certain death, but injuring himself to the point that he could not be moved. The grateful father helped the Nagwal build the shack for the man who had saved his daughter. And in 3 months the Nagwal accomplished the impossible. He healed the young man. When the time came for the Nagwal to leave, his sense of responsibility and his duty required him both to warn the young woman about her excess energy and the injurious consequences it would have on her life and well-being, and to ask her to join the sorcerer's world, as that would be the only defense against her self-destructive strength. The woman did not respond. And the Nagwal Elias was obliged to tell her what every Nagwal has said to a prospective apprentice throughout the ages. That sorcerers speak of sorcery as a magical, mysterious bird, which has paused in its flight for a moment in order to give man hope and purpose. That sorcerers live under the wing of that bird, which they call the bird of wisdom, the bird of freedom, that they nourish it with their dedication and impeccability. He told her that sorcerers knew the flight of the bird of freedom was always a straight line, since it had no way of making a loop, no way of circling back and returning, and that the bird of freedom could do only 2 things: take sorcerers along, or leave them behind. The Nagwal Elias could not talk to the young actor, who was still mortally ill, in the same way. The young man did not have much of a choice. Still, the Nagwal told him that if he wanted to be cured, he would have to follow the Nagwal unconditionally. The actor accepted the terms instantly. The day the Nagwal Elias and the actor started back home, the young woman was waiting silently at the edge of town. She carried no suitcases, not even a basket. She seemed to have come merely to see them off. The Nagwal kept walking without looking at her, but the actor, being carried on a stretcher, strained to say goodbye to her. She laughed and wordlessly merged into the Nagwal's party. She had no doubts and no problem about leaving everything behind. She had understood perfectly that there was no second chance for her, that the bird of freedom either took sorcerers along or left them behind. Don Juan commented that that was not surprising. The force of the Nagwal's personality was always so overwhelming that he was practically irresistible, and the Nagwal Elias had affected those 2 people deeply. He had had 3 months of daily interaction to accustom them to his consistency, his detachment, his objectivity. They had become enchanted by his sobriety and, above all, by his total dedication to them. Through his example and his actions, the Nagwal Elias had given them a sustained view of the sorcerer's world. Supportive and nurturing, yet utterly demanding. It was a world that admitted very few mistakes. Don Juan reminded me then of something he had repeated to me often, but which I had always managed not to think about. He said that I should not forget, even for an instant, that the bird of freedom had very little patience with indecision, and when it flew away, it never returned. The chilling resonance of his voice made the surroundings, which only a second before had been peacefully dark, burst with immediacy. Don Juan summoned the peaceful darkness back as fast as he had summoned urgency. He punched me lightly on the arm. "That woman was so powerful that she could dance circles around anyone," he said. "Her name was Talia. The knock of the spirit." The abstract. We returned to Don Juan's house in the early hours of the morning. It took us a long time to climb down the mountain, mainly because I was afraid of stumbling into a precipice in the dark, and Don Juan had to keep stopping to catch the breath he lost laughing at me. I was dead tired, but I could not fall asleep. Before noon, it began to rain. The sound of the heavy downpour on the tile roof, instead of making me feel drowsy, removed every trace of sleepiness. I got up and went to look for Don Juan. I found him dozing in a chair. The moment I approached him, he was wide awake. I said, "Good morning." "You seem to be having no trouble falling asleep," I commented. "When you have been afraid or upset, don't lie down to sleep," he said without looking at me. "Sleep sitting up on a soft chair as I'm doing." He had suggested once that if I wanted to give my body healing rest, I should take long naps, lying on my stomach with my face turned to the left and my feet over the foot of the bed. In order to avoid being cold, he recommended I put a soft pillow over my shoulders, away from my neck, and wear heavy socks, or just leave my shoes on. When I first heard his suggestion, I thought he was being funny, but later changed my mind. Sleeping in that position helped me rest extraordinarily well. When I commented on the surprising results, he advised that I follow his suggestions to the letter without bothering to believe or disbelieve him. I suggested to Don Juan that he might have told me the night before about the sleeping in a sitting position. I explained to him that the cause of my sleeplessness, besides my extreme fatigue, was a strange concern about what he had told me in the sorcerer's cave. "Cut it out!" he exclaimed. "You've seen and heard infinitely more distressing things without losing a moment's sleep. Something else is bothering you." For a moment I thought he meant I was not being truthful with him about my real preoccupation. I began to explain, but he kept talking as if I had not spoken. "You stated categorically last night that the cave didn't make you feel ill at ease," he said. "Well, it obviously did. Last night I didn't pursue the subject of the cave any further because I was waiting to observe your reaction." Don Juan explained that the cave had been designed by sorcerers in ancient times to serve as a catalyst. Its shape had been carefully constructed to accommodate two people as two fields of energy. The theory of the sorcerers was that the nature of the rock and the manner in which it had been carved allowed the two bodies, the two luminous balls, to intertwine their energy. "I took you to that cave on purpose," he continued, "not because I like the place, I don't, but because it was created as an instrument to push the apprentice deep into heightened awareness. But unfortunately, as it helps, it also obscures issues. The ancient sorcerers were not given to thought. They leaned toward action." "You always say that your benefactor was like that," I said. "That's my own exaggeration," he answered, "very much like when I say you're a fool. My benefactor was a modern Nagual, involved in the pursuit of freedom, but he leaned toward action instead of thoughts. You're a modern Nagwal, involved in the same quest, but you lean heavily toward the aberrations of reason. He must have thought his comparison was very funny. His laughter echoed in the empty room. When I brought the conversation back to the subject of the cave, he pretended not to hear me. I knew he was pretending because of the glint in his eyes and the way he smiled. Last night, I deliberately told you the first abstract core, he said, in the hope that by reflecting on the way I have acted with you over the years, you'll get an idea about the other cores. You've been with me for a long time, so you know me very well. During every minute of our association, I have tried to adjust my actions and thoughts to the patterns of the abstract cores. The Nagwal Elias's story is another matter. Although it seems to be a story about people, it is really a story about intent. Intent creates edifices before us and invites us to enter them. This is the way sorcerers understand what is happening around them. Don Juan reminded me that I had always insisted on trying to discover the underlying order in everything he said to me. I thought he was criticizing me for my attempt to turn whatever he was teaching me into a social science problem. I began to tell him that my outlook had changed under his influence. He stopped me and smiled. "You really don't think too well," he said and sighed. "I want you to understand the underlying order of what I teach you. My objection is to what you think is the underlying order. To you, it means secret procedures or a hidden consistency. To me, it means two things. Both the edifice that intent manufactures in the blink of an eye and places in front of us to enter, and the signs it gives us, so we won't get lost once we are inside." As you can see, the story of the Nagwal Elias was more than merely an account of the sequential details that made up the event, he went on. Underneath all that was the edifice of intent. And the story was meant to give you an idea of what the Nagwals of the past were like, so that you would recognize how they acted in order to adjust their thoughts and actions to the edifices of intent. There was a prolonged silence. I did not have anything to say. Rather than let the conversation die, I said the first thing that came into my mind. I said that from the stories I had heard about the Nagwal Elias, I had formed a very positive opinion of him. I liked the Nagwal Elias, but for unknown reasons, everything Don Juan had told me about the Nagwal Julian bothered me. The mere mention of my discomfort delighted Don Juan beyond measure. He had to stand up from his chair lest he choke on his laughter. He put his arm on my shoulder and said that we either loved or hated those who were reflections of ourselves. Again, a silly self-consciousness prevented me from asking him what he meant. Don Juan kept on laughing, obviously aware of my mood. He finally commented that the Nagwal Julian was like a child whose sobriety and moderation came always from without. He had no inner discipline beyond his training as an apprentice in sorcery. I had an irrational urge to defend myself. I told Don Juan that my discipline came from within me. "Of course," he said patronizingly. "You just can't expect to be exactly like him." And began to laugh again. Sometimes Don Juan exasperated me so that I was ready to yell. But my mood did not last. It dissipated so rapidly that another concern began to loom. I asked Don Juan if it was possible that I had entered into heightened awareness without being conscious of it. Or maybe I had remained in it for days. "At this state you enter into heightened awareness all by yourself," he said. "Heightened awareness is a mystery only for our reason. In practice, it's very simple. As with everything else, we complicate matters by trying to make the immensity that surrounds us reasonable. He remarked that I should be thinking about the abstract core he had given me, instead of arguing uselessly about my person. I told him that I had been thinking about it all morning and had come to realize that the metaphorical theme of the story was the manifestations of the spirit. What I could not discern, however, was the abstract core he was talking about. It had to be something unstated. I repeat, he said, as if he were a schoolteacher drilling his students, the manifestations of the spirit is the name for the first abstract core in the sorcery stories. Obviously, what sorcerers recognize as an abstract core is something that bypasses you at this moment. That part which escapes you sorcerers know as the edifice of intent, or the silent voice of the spirit, or the ulterior arrangement of the abstract. I said I understood ulterior to mean something not overtly revealed, as in ulterior motive. And he replied that in this case ulterior meant more. It meant knowledge without words, outside our immediate comprehension, especially mine. He allowed that the comprehension he was referring to was merely beyond my aptitudes of the moment, not beyond my ultimate possibilities for understanding. If the abstract cores are beyond my comprehension, what's the point of talking about them? I asked. The rule says that the abstract cores and the sorcery stories must be told at this point, he replied. And someday the ulterior arrangement of the abstract, which is knowledge without words or the edifice of intent inherent in the stories, will be revealed to you by the stories themselves. I still did not understand. The ulterior arrangement of the abstract is not merely the order in which the abstract cores were presented to you, he explained, or what they have in common either, nor even the web that joins them. Rather, it's to know the abstract directly, without the intervention of language. He scrutinized me in silence from head to toe, with the obvious purpose of seeing me. It's not evident to you yet, he declared. He made a gesture of impatience, even short temper, as though he were annoyed at my slowness. And that worried me. Don Juan was not given to expressions of psychological displeasure. It has nothing to do with you or your actions, he said when I asked if he was angry or disappointed with me. It was a thought that crossed my mind the moment I saw you. There is a feature in your luminous being that the old sorcerers would have given anything to have. Tell me what it is, I demanded. I'll remind you of this some other time, he said. Meanwhile, let's continue with the element that propels us. The abstract. The element without which there could be no warrior's path, nor any warriors in search of knowledge. He said that the difficulties I was experiencing were nothing new to him. He himself had gone through agonies in order to understand the ulterior order of the abstract. And had it not been for the helping hand of the Nagual Elias, he would have wound up just like his benefactor, all action and very little understanding. What was the Nagual Elias like? I asked, to change the subject. He was not like his disciple at all, Don Juan said. He was an Indian. Very dark and massive. He had rough features, big mouth, strong nose, small black eyes, thick black hair with no gray in it. He was shorter than the Nagual Julian and had big hands and feet. He was very humble and very wise, but he had no flair. Compared with my benefactor, he was dull. Always all by himself, pondering questions. The Nagual Julian used to joke that his teacher imparted wisdom by the ton. Behind his back he used to call him the Nagual Tonnage. I never saw the reason for his jokes, Don Juan went on. To me the Nagual Elias was like a breath of fresh air. He would patiently explain everything to me. Very much as I explain things to you, but perhaps with a bit more of something. I wouldn't call it compassion, but rather, empathy. Warriors are incapable of feeling compassion because they no longer feel sorry for themselves. Without the driving force of self-pity, compassion is meaningless. Are you saying, Don Juan, that a warrior is all for himself? In a way, yes. For a warrior everything begins and ends with himself. However, his contact with the abstract causes him to overcome his feeling of self-importance. Then the self becomes abstract and impersonal. The Nagual Elias felt that our lives and our personalities were quite similar, Don Juan continued. For this reason, he felt obliged to help me. I don't feel that similarity with you, so I suppose I regard you very much the way the Nagual Julian used to regard me. Don Juan said that the Nagual Elias took him under his wing from the very first day he arrived at his benefactor's house to start his apprenticeship, and began to explain what was taking place in his training, regardless of whether Don Juan was capable of understanding. His urge to help Don Juan was so intense that he practically held him prisoner. He protected him in this manner from the Nagual Julian's harsh onslaughts. At the beginning, I used to stay at the Nagual Elias's house all the time, Don Juan continued. And I loved it. In my benefactor's house I was always on the lookout, on guard, afraid of what he was going to do to me next. But in the Nagual Elias's home I felt confident, at ease. My benefactor used to press me mercilessly. And I couldn't figure out why he was pressuring me so hard. I thought that the man was plain crazy. Don Juan said that the Nagual Elias was an Indian from the state of Oaxaca, who had been taught by another Nagual named Rosendo, who came from the same area. Don Juan described the Nagual Elias as being a very conservative man who cherished his privacy. And yet he was a famous healer and sorcerer, not only in Oaxaca, but in all of southern Mexico. Nonetheless, in spite of his occupation and notoriety, he lived in complete isolation at the opposite end of the country, in northern Mexico. Don Juan stopped talking. Raising his eyebrows, he fixed me with a questioning look. But all I wanted was for him to continue his story. Every single time I think you should ask questions, you don't, he said. I'm sure you heard me say that the Nagual Elias was a famous sorcerer who dealt with people daily in southern Mexico, and at the same time he was a hermit in northern Mexico. Doesn't that arouse your curiosity? I felt abysmally stupid. I told him that the thought had crossed my mind, as he was telling me those facts, that the man must have had terrible difficulty commuting. Don Juan laughed, and, since he had made me aware of the question, I asked how it had been possible for the Nagual Elias to be in two places at once. Dreaming is a sorcerer's jet plane, he said. The Nagual Elias was a dreamer as my benefactor was a stalker. He was able to create and project what sorcerers know as the dreaming body, or the other, and to be in two distant places at the same time. With his dreaming body, he could carry on his business as a sorcerer, and with his natural self be a recluse. I remarked that it amazed me that I could accept so easily the premise that the Nagual Elias had the ability to project a solid three-dimensional image of himself, and yet could not for the life of me understand the explanations about the abstract cores. Don Juan said that I could accept the idea of the Nagual Elias's dual life because the spirit was making final adjustments in my capacity for awareness. And I exploded into a barrage of protests at the obscurity of his statement. "It isn't obscure," he said. "It's a statement of fact. You could say that it's an incomprehensible fact for the moment, but the moment will change." Before I could reply, he began to talk again about the Nagual Elias. He said that the Nagual Elias had a very inquisitive mind and could work well with his hands. In his journeys as a dreamer he saw many objects, which he copied in wood and forged iron. Don Juan assured me that some of those models were of a haunting, exquisite beauty. "What kind of objects were the originals?" I asked. "There's no way of knowing," Don Juan said. "You've got to consider that because he was an Indian, the Nagual Elias went into his dreaming journeys the way a wild animal prowls for food. An animal never shows up at a site when there are signs of activity. He comes only when no one is around." The Nagual Elias, as a solitary dreamer, visited, let's say, the junkyard of infinity when no one was around and copied whatever he saw, but never knew what those things were used for or their source. Again, I had no trouble accepting what he was saying. The idea did not appear to me far-fetched in any way. I was about to comment when he interrupted me with a gesture of his eyebrows. He then continued his account about the Nagual Elias. "Visiting him was for me the ultimate treat," he said, "and simultaneously, a source of strange guilt. I used to get bored to death there. Not because Nagual Elias was boring, but because the Nagual Julian had no peers, and he spoiled anyone for life." "But I thought you were confident and at ease in the Nagual Elias's house," I said. "I was, and that was the source of my guilt and my imagined problem. Like you, I love to torment myself. I think at the very beginning I found peace in the Nagual Elias's company, but later on, when I understood the Nagual Julian better, I went his way." He told me that the Nagual Elias's house had an open, roofed section in the front, where he had a forge and a carpentry bench and tools. The tiled roof adobe house consisted of a huge room with a dirt floor where he lived with 5 women seers, who were actually his wives. There were also 4 men, sorcerer seers of his party who lived in small houses around the Nagual's house. They were all Indians from different parts of the country who had migrated to northern Mexico. The Nagual Elias had great respect for sexual energy, Don Juan said. He believed it has been given to us so we can use it in dreaming. He believed dreaming had fallen into disuse because it can upset the precarious mental balance of susceptible people. "I've taught you dreaming the same way he taught me," he continued. "He taught me that while we dream the assemblage point moves very gently and naturally. Mental balance is nothing but the fixing of the assemblage point on one spot we're accustomed to. If dreams make that point move, and dreaming is used to control that natural movement, and sexual energy is needed for dreaming, the result is sometimes disastrous when sexual energy is dissipated in sex instead of dreaming. Then dreamers move their assemblage point erratically and lose their minds." "What are you trying to tell me, Don Juan?" I asked because I felt that the subject of dreaming had not been a natural drift in the conversation. "You are a dreamer," he said. "If you're not careful with your sexual energy, you might as well get used to the idea of erratic shifts of your assemblage point. A moment ago you were bewildered by your reactions. Well, Your assemblage point moves almost erratically because your sexual energy is not in balance. I made a stupid and inappropriate comment about the sex life of adult males. Our sexual energy is what governs dreaming, he explained. The Nagwal Elias taught me, and I taught you, that you either make love with your sexual energy or you dream with it. There is no other way. The reason I mention it at all is because you are having great difficulty shifting your assemblage point to grasp our last topic. The abstract. The same thing happened to me, Don Juan went on. It was only when my sexual energy was freed from the world that everything fit into place. That is the rule for dreamers. Stalkers are the opposite. My benefactor was, you could say, a sexual libertine both as an average man and as an Nagwal. Don Juan seemed to be on the verge of revealing his benefactor's doings, but he obviously changed his mind. He shook his head and said that I was way too stiff for such revelations. I did not insist. He said that the Nagwal Elias had the sobriety that only dreamers acquired after inconceivable battles with themselves. He used his sobriety to plunge himself into the task of answering Don Juan's questions. The Nagwal Elias explained that my difficulty in understanding the spirit was the same as his own, Don Juan continued. He thought there were two different issues. 1. The need to understand indirectly what the spirit is, and the other, to understand the spirit directly. You're having problems with the first. Once you understand what the spirit is, the second issue will be resolved automatically, and vice versa. If the spirit speaks to you, using its silent words, you will certainly know immediately what the spirit is. He said that the Nagwal Elias believed that the difficulty was our reluctance to accept the idea that knowledge could exist without words to explain it. But I have no difficulty accepting that, I said. Accepting this proposition is not as easy as saying you accept it, Don Juan said. The Nagwal Elias used to tell me that the whole of humanity has moved away from the abstract, although at one time we must have been close to it. It must have been our sustaining force. And then something happened and pulled us away from the abstract. Now we can't get back to it. He used to say that it takes years for an apprentice to be able to go back to the abstract, that is, to know that knowledge and language can exist independent of each other. Don Juan repeated that the crux of our difficulty in going back to the abstract was our refusal to accept that we could know without words or even without thoughts. I was going to argue that he was talking nonsense when I got the strong feeling I was missing something, and that his point was of crucial importance to me. He was really trying to tell me something I either could not grasp or which could not be told completely. Knowledge and language are separate, he repeated softly. And I was just about to say, I know it, as if indeed I knew it, when I caught myself. I told you there is no way to talk about the spirit, he continued, because the spirit can only be experienced. Sorcerers try to explain this condition when they say that the spirit is nothing you can see or feel. But it's there looming over us always. Sometimes it comes to some of us. Most of the time it seems indifferent. I kept quiet. And he continued to explain. He said that the spirit in many ways was a sort of wild animal. It kept its distance from us until a moment when something enticed it forward. It was then that the spirit manifested itself. I raised the point that if the spirit wasn't an entity, or a presence, and had no essence, how could anyone entice it? Your problem, he said, is that you consider only your own idea of what's abstract. For instance, the inner essence of man, or the fundamental principle, are abstracts for you. Or perhaps something a bit less vague, such as character, volition, courage, dignity, honor. The spirit, of course, can be described in terms of all of these. And that's what's so confusing, that it's all these and none of them. He added that what I considered abstractions were either the opposites of all the practicalities I could think of, or things I had decided did not have concrete existence. Whereas for a sorcerer, an abstract is something with no parallel in the human condition, he said. But they're the same thing, I shouted. Don't you see that we're both talking about the same thing? We are not, he insisted. For a sorcerer, the spirit is an abstract simply because he knows it without words or even thoughts. It's an abstract because he can't conceive what a spirit is. Yet without the slightest chance or desire to understand it, a sorcerer handles the spirit. He recognizes it, beckons it, entices it, becomes familiar with it, and expresses it with his acts. I shook my head in despair. I could not see the difference. The root of your misconception is that I have used the term abstract to describe the spirit, he said. For you, abstracts are words which describe states of intuition. An example is the word spirit, which doesn't describe reason or pragmatic experience, and which, of course, is of no use to you other than to tickle your fancy. I was furious with Don Juan. I called him obstinate and he laughed at me. He suggested that if I would think about the proposition that knowledge might be independent of language, without bothering to understand it, perhaps I could see the light. Consider this, he said. It was not the act of meeting me that mattered to you. The day I met you, you met the abstract. But since you couldn't talk about it, you didn't notice it. Sorcerers meet the abstract without thinking about it or seeing it or touching it or feeling its presence. I remained quiet because I did not enjoy arguing with him. At times I considered him to be quite willfully abstruse. But Don Juan seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. The last seduction of Nagual Julian. It was as cool and quiet in the patio of Don Juan's house as in the cloister of a convent. There were a number of large fruit trees planted extremely close together, which seemed to regulate the temperature and absorb all noises. When I first came to his house, I had made critical remarks about the illogical way the fruit trees had been planted. I would have given them more space. His answer was that those trees were not his property, they were free and independent warrior trees that had joined his party of warriors, and that my comments which applied to regular trees were not relevant. His reply sounded metaphorical to me. What I didn't know then was that Don Juan meant everything he said literally. Don Juan and I were sitting in cane armchairs facing the fruit trees now. The trees were all bearing fruit. I commented that it was not only a beautiful sight, but an extremely intriguing one, for it was not the fruit season. There is an interesting story about it, he admitted. As you know, these trees are warriors of my party. They are bearing now because all the members of my party have been talking and expressing feelings about our definitive journey, here in front of them. And the trees know now that when we embark on our definitive journey, they will accompany us. I looked at him, astonished. I can't leave them behind, he explained. They are warriors too. They have thrown their lot in with the Nagual's party. And they know how I feel about them. The assemblage point of trees is located very low in their enormous luminous shell, and that permits them to know our feelings, for instance, the feelings we are having now as we discuss my definitive journey. I remained quiet, for I did not want to dwell on the subject. Don Juan spoke and dispelled my mood. The second abstract core of the sorcery stories is called the knock of the spirit, he said. The first core, the manifestations of the spirit, is the edifice that intent builds and places before a sorcerer, then invites him to enter. It is the edifice of intent seen by a sorcerer. The knock of the spirit is the same edifice seen by the beginner who is invited or rather forced to enter. This second abstract core could be a story in itself. The story says that after the spirit had manifested itself to that man we have talked about and had gotten no response, the spirit laid a trap for the man. It was a final subterfuge, not because the man was special, but because the incomprehensible chain of events of the spirit made that man available at the very moment that the spirit knocked on the door. It goes without saying that whatever the spirit revealed to that man made no sense to him. In fact, it went against everything the man knew, everything he was. The man, of course, refused on the spot, and in no uncertain terms, to have anything to do with the spirit. He wasn't going to fall for such preposterous nonsense. He knew better. The result was a total stalemate. I can say that this is an idiotic story, he continued. I can say that what I've given you is the pacifier for those who are uncomfortable with the silence of the abstract. He peered at me for a moment and then smiled. You like words, he said accusingly. The mere idea of silent knowledge scares you. But stories, no matter how stupid, delight you and make you feel secure. His smile was so mischievous that I couldn't help laughing. Then he reminded me that I had already heard his detailed account of the first time the spirit had knocked on his door. For a moment I could not figure out what he was talking about. It was not just my benefactor who stumbled upon me as I was dying from the gunshot, he explained. The spirit also found me and knocked on my door that day. My benefactor understood that he was there to be a conduit for the spirit. Without the spirit's intervention, meeting my benefactor would have meant nothing. He said that an agwal can be a conduit only after the spirit has manifested its willingness to be used either almost imperceptibly or with outright commands. It was therefore not possible for an agwal to choose his apprentices according to his own volition or his own calculations. But once the willingness of the spirit was revealed through omens, the agwal spared no effort to satisfy it. After a lifetime of practice, he continued, sorcerers, agwals in particular, know if the spirit is inviting them to enter the edifice being flaunted before them. They have learned to discipline their connecting links to intent. So they are always forewarned, always know what the spirit has in store for them. Don Juan said that progress along the sorcerer's path was, in general, a drastic process, the purpose of which was to bring this connecting link to order. The average man's connecting link with intent is practically dead, and sorcerers begin with a link that is useless because it does not respond voluntarily. He stressed that in order to revive that link, sorcerers needed a rigorous, fierce purpose, a special state of mind called unbending intent. Accepting that the agwal was the only being capable of supplying unbending intent was the most difficult part of the sorcerer's apprenticeship. I argued that I could not see the difficulty. An apprentice is someone who is striving to clear and revive his connecting link with the spirit, he explained. Once the link is revived, He is no longer an apprentice, but until that time, in order to keep going, he needs a fierce purpose, which, of course, he doesn't have. So he allows the Nagwal to provide the purpose, and to do that he has to relinquish his individuality. That's the difficult part. He reminded me of something he had told me often. That volunteers were not welcome in the sorcerer's world because they already had a purpose of their own, which made it particularly hard for them to relinquish their individuality. If the sorcerer's world demanded ideas and actions contrary to the volunteer's purpose, the volunteers simply refused to change. Reviving an apprentice's link is a Nagwal's most challenging and intriguing work, Don Juan continued, and one of his biggest headaches too. Depending, of course, on the apprentice's personality, the designs of the spirit are either sublimely simple or the most complex labyrinths. Don Juan assured me that, although I might have had notions to the contrary, my apprenticeship had not been as onerous to him as his must have been to his benefactor. He admitted that I had a modicum of self-discipline that came in very handy, while he had had none whatever. And his benefactor, in turn, had had even less. The difference is discernible in the manifestations of the spirit, he continued. In some cases, they are barely noticeable. In my case, they were commands. I had been shot. Blood was pouring out of a hole in my chest. My benefactor had to act with speed and sureness, just as his own benefactor had for him. Sorcerers know that the more difficult the command is, the more difficult the disciple turns out to be. Don Juan explained that one of the most advantageous aspects of his association with two Nagwals was that he could hear the same stories from two opposite points of view. For instance, the story about the Nagwal Elias and the manifestations of the spirit, from the apprentice's perspective, was the story of the spirit's difficult knock on his benefactor's door. Everything connected with my benefactor was very difficult, he said and began to laugh. When he was 24 years old, the spirit didn't just knock on his door, it nearly banged it down. He said that the story had really begun years earlier, when his benefactor had been a handsome adolescent from a good family in Mexico City. He was wealthy, educated, charming, and had a charismatic personality. Women fell in love with him at first sight. But he was already self-indulgent and undisciplined, lazy about anything that did not give him immediate gratification. Don Juan said that with that personality and his type of upbringing, he was the only son of a wealthy widow who, together with his 4 adoring sisters, doted on him. He could only behave one way. He indulged in every impropriety he could think of. Even among his equally self-indulgent friends, he was seen as a moral delinquent who lived to do anything that the world considered morally wrong. In the long run, his excesses weakened him physically, and he fell mortally ill with tuberculosis, the dreaded disease of the time. But his illness, instead of restraining him, created a physical condition in which he felt more sensual than ever. Since he did not have one iota of self-control, he gave himself over fully to debauchery, and his health deteriorated until there was no hope. The saying that it never rains but it pours was certainly true for Don Juan's benefactor then. As his health declined, his mother, who was his only source of support and the only restraint on him, died. She left him a sizable inheritance, which should have supported him adequately for life, but undisciplined as he was, in a few months he had spent every cent. With no profession or trade to fall back on, he was left to scrounge for a living. Without money he no longer had friends, and even the women who once loved him turned their backs. For the first time in his life, he found himself confronting a harsh reality. Considering the state of his health, it should have been the end. But he was resilient. He decided to work for a living. His sensual habits, however, could not be changed, and they forced him to seek work in the only place he felt comfortable: the theater. His qualifications were that he was a born ham and had spent most of his adult life in the company of actresses. He joined a theatrical troupe in the provinces, away from his familiar circle of friends and acquaintances, and became a very intense actor, the consumptive hero in religious and morality plays. Don Juan commented on the strange irony that had always marked his benefactor's life. There he was, a perfect reprobate, dying as a result of his dissolute ways, and playing the roles of saints and mystics. He even played Jesus in the Passion Play during Holy Week. His health lasted through one theatrical tour of the northern states. Then two things happened in the city of Durango. His life came to an end and the spirit knocked on his door. Both his death and the spirit's knock came at the same time in broad daylight in the bushes. His death caught him in the act of seducing a young woman. He was already extremely weak, and that day he overexerted himself. The young woman, who was vivacious and strong and madly infatuated, had by promising to make love induced him to walk to a secluded spot miles from nowhere. And there she had fought him off for hours. When she finally submitted, he was completely worn out and coughing so badly that he could hardly breathe. During his last passionate outburst, he felt a searing pain in his shoulder. His chest felt as if it were being ripped apart, and a coughing spell made him retch uncontrollably. His compulsion to seek pleasure kept him going until his death came in the form of a hemorrhage. It was then that the spirit made its entry, borne by an Indian who came to his aid. Earlier he had noticed the Indian following them around, but had not given him a second thought, absorbed as he was in the seduction. He saw, as in a dream, the girl. She was not scared, nor did she lose her composure. Quietly and efficiently she put her clothes back on and took off as fast as a rabbit chased by hounds. He also saw the Indian rushing to him trying to make him sit up. He heard him saying idiotic things. He heard him pledging himself to the spirit and mumbling incomprehensible words in a foreign language. Then the Indian acted very quickly. Standing behind him, he gave him a smacking blow on the back. Very rationally, the dying man deduced that the Indian was trying either to dislodge the blood clot or to kill him. As the Indian struck him repeatedly on the back, the dying man became convinced that the Indian was the woman's lover or husband and was murdering him. But seeing the intensely brilliant eyes of that Indian, he changed his mind. He knew that the Indian was simply crazy and was not connected with the woman. With his last bit of consciousness, he focused his attention on the man's mumblings. What he was saying was that the power of man was incalculable, that death existed only because we had intended it since the moment of our birth, that the intent of death could be suspended by making the assemblage point change positions. He then knew that the Indian was totally insane. His situation was so theatrical, dying at the hands of a crazy Indian mumbling gibberish, that he vowed he would be a ham actor to the bitter end, and he promised himself not to die of either the hemorrhaging or the blows, but to die of laughter. And he laughed until he was dead. Don Juan remarked that naturally his benefactor could not possibly have taken the Indian seriously. No one could take such a person seriously, especially not a prospective apprentice who was not supposed to be volunteering for the sorcery task. Don Juan then said that he had given me different versions of what that sorcery task consisted. He said it would not be presumptuous of him to disclose that, from the spirit's point of view, the task consisted of clearing our connecting link with it. The edifice that intent flaunts before us is, then, a clearinghouse, within which we find not so much the procedures to clear our connecting link, as the silent knowledge that allows the clearing process to take place. Without that silent knowledge no process could work, and all we would have would be an indefinite sense of needing something. He explained that the events unleashed by sorcerers as a result of silent knowledge were so simple and yet so abstract that sorcerers had decided long ago to speak of those events only in symbolic terms. The manifestations and the knock of the spirit were examples. Don Juan said that, for instance, a description of what took place during the initial meeting between a Nagual and a prospective apprentice from the sorcerer's point of view would be absolutely incomprehensible. It would be nonsense to explain that the Nagual, by virtue of his lifelong experience, was focusing something we couldn't imagine. His second attention, the increased awareness gained through sorcery training on his invisible connection with some indefinable abstract. He was doing this to emphasize and clarify someone else's invisible connection with that indefinable abstract. He remarked that each of us was barred from silent knowledge by natural barriers, specific to each individual, and that the most impregnable of my barriers was the drive to disguise my complacency as independence. I challenged him to give me a concrete example. I reminded him that he had once warned me that a favorite debating ploy was to raise general criticisms that could not be supported by concrete examples. Don Juan looked at me and beamed. In the past, I used to give you power plants, he said. At first, you went to extremes to convince yourself that what you were experiencing were hallucinations. Then you wanted them to be special hallucinations. I remember I made fun of your insistence on calling them didactic hallucinatory experiences. He said that my need to prove my illusory independence forced me into a position where I could not accept what he had told me was happening, although it was what I silently knew for myself. I knew he was employing power plants, as the very limited tools they were, to make me enter partial or temporary states of heightened awareness by moving my assemblage point away from its habitual location. You used your barrier of independence to get you over that obstruction, he went on. The same barrier has continued to work to this day, so you still retain that sense of indefinite anguish, perhaps not so pronounced. Now the question is, how are you arranging your conclusions so that your current experiences fit into your scheme of complacency? I confessed that the only way I could maintain my independence was not to think about my experiences at all. Don Juan's hearty laugh nearly made him fall out of his cane chair. He stood and walked around to catch his breath. He sat down again and composed himself. He pushed his chair back and crossed his legs. He said that we, as average men, did not know, nor would we ever know, that it was something utterly real and functional, our connecting link with intent, which gave us our hereditary preoccupation with fate. He asserted that during our active lives, we never have the chance to go beyond the level of mere preoccupation, because since time immemorial the lull of daily affairs has made us drowsy. It is only when our lives are nearly over that our hereditary preoccupation with fate begins to take on a different character. It begins to make us see through the fog of daily affairs. Unfortunately, this awakening always comes hand in hand with loss of energy caused by aging, when we have no more strength left to turn our preoccupation into a pragmatic and positive discovery. At this point, all there is left is an amorphous piercing anguish, a longing for something indescribable, and simple anger at having missed out. I like poems for many reasons, he said. One reason is that they catch the mood of warriors and explain what can hardly be explained. He conceded that poets were keenly aware of our connecting link with the spirit, but that they were aware of it intuitively, not in the deliberate, pragmatic way of sorcerers. Poets have no first-hand knowledge of the spirit, he went on. That is why their poems cannot really hit the center of true gestures for the spirit. They hit pretty close to it, though. He picked up one of my poetry books from a chair next to him, a collection by Juan Ramon Jimenez. He opened it to where he had placed a marker, handed it to me and signaled me to read. Is it I who walks tonight in my room, or is it the beggar who was prowling in my garden at nightfall? I look around and find that everything is the same, and it is not the same. Was the window open? Had I not already fallen asleep? Was not the garden pale green? The sky was clear and blue, and there are clouds, and it is windy, and the garden is dark and gloomy. I think that my hair was black, I was dressed in gray. And my hair is gray, and I am wearing black. Is this my gait? Does this voice, which now resounds in me, have the rhythms of the voice I used to have? Am I myself, or am I the beggar who was prowling in my garden at nightfall? I look around, there are clouds, and it is windy, the garden is dark and gloomy. I come and go. Is it not true that I had already fallen asleep? My hair is gray. And everything is the same, and it is not the same. I reread the poem to myself, and I caught the poet's mood of impotence and bewilderment. I asked Don Juan if he felt the same. I think the poet senses the pressure of aging and the anxiety that realization produces, Don Juan said. But that is only one part of it. The other part, which interests me, is that the poet, although he never moves his assemblage point, intuits that something extraordinary is at stake. He intuits with great certainty that there is some unnamed factor, awesome because of its simplicity, that is determining our fate. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.